How do you evict the owner of the lake? My HOA tried. I inherited a $50 million lake ranch, and within minutes the HOA slapped me with a $100K fine, on land my family's owned for nearly a century. That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with rules. I was dealing with an empire built on lies. Stick with me, because what the judge uncovered shocked this entire valley. And if you love seeing justice handed out the right way, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next fight. The gravel crunched under the tires of my old Ford as I eased down the winding ranch road, the kind that had been carved by generations of boots, hooves, and weather rather than any county planner. The air smelled like pine resin and cold water, the kind of scent that made a man slow down and breathe just a little deeper. After 20 years working on dams from Wyoming to Utah, you'd think I'd be immune to scenery, but Coldwater Lake had a way of slipping past a man's defenses. I rolled to a stop beside the weathered wooden gate my uncle had built before I was born. The Reeves Ranch brand, 2 crossed ridge lines, was still burned into the plank, though half faded from Montana winters. I pushed the gate open, hinges groaning like an old man stretching after a long sleep, and drove the final stretch toward the lake. 800 acres of forest, meadow, and untouched shoreline, all unexpectedly mine because the uncle who'd cut my father out of his will had somehow left everything to me. The lodge came into view first, a 2-story frame of cedar logs standing proud against the morning light. Beyond it, the lake shimmered, cold water, deep and glassy, reflecting the sky like a mirror someone had polished since the last snowmelt. My uncle had lived his final years in isolation, and in all that time he had never once called. Now he was gone, and the land felt like a question he'd left waiting for me to answer. I grabbed my duffel, walked past the firewood stack that still held the scent of fresh axe cuts, and headed down toward the boathouse. The boards creaked under my boots, soft from age but sturdy. The lake's surface lapped gently against the posts, sending up cool mist. Then I saw it. A sharp piece of red slapped against the cedar door like a wound. A violation notice. I stopped cold. The paper fluttered in the breeze, bright as a warning flare. My name was typed across the top, beneath a bold header. Silvercrest Shores HOA Enforcement Division. I frowned. HOA? Out here? The text below was even worse. Fine issued, $100,000. Reason: unauthorized access to community waterfront. Deadline: 72 hours. My jaw tightened. Unauthorized? This boathouse had been built by my grandfather in 1926. This dock had held every Reeves rowboat, canoe, and motor skiff since before half the country's subdivisions even existed. I tore the notice down, the tape snapping loud in the quiet morning, and stared across the lake. The water glimmered in that blue-green shade that always reminded me of glacial melt. My uncle's old journal had said the lake was 98 years in our family. Older than the state highway, older than Silvercrest Shores, older than any HOA that dared to tape a bill to our wood. The wind shifted, carrying with it the low hum of something mechanical. I turned. A white electric cart rolled down the trail from the ridge, tires whispering over gravel. The woman driving it wore a pale blue blazer pressed so stiff it seemed immune to wind. Silver hair rolled into a tight chignon, sunglasses that probably cost more than the truck I'd driven in. She stopped 20 feet away, stepped off with clipped precision, and offered a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "Mr. Reeves, I presume." I nodded slowly. "And you are?" She clasped her hands in front of her. "Vivian Markham, president of the Silvercrest Shores Homeowners Association." Of course she was. Vivian's gaze drifted from the dock to the boathouse to the lodge rising behind me. She looked at it the way a banker looks at unpaid debt, clinical, hungry, ready to claim ownership. "I see you've found our notice," she said, motioning to the torn paper in my hand. Your presence on this shoreline constitutes a direct violation of Section 4B of our community code. Your community code, I said slowly, doesn't apply to Reeves' land. She gave a soft laugh, the condescending kind reserved for children and men she assumed were uneducated. This waterfront is part of Silvercrest Shore's designated recreational boundary. Your uncle's former residence sits adjacent to HOA-managed easements. Access is restricted without proper registration. My heartbeat thudded once, hard. My family has owned this lake for nearly a century. Vivian tilted her head, a faint crack in her polished veneer. Mr. Reeves, ownership lines can be more fluid than memory suggests. Our records show this area has been integrated into Silvercrest management for over 2 decades. If you disagree, you may present appeal paperwork after paying the outstanding fine. Paying the... I stared at her. You want me to pay $100,000 for stepping onto my own dock? She smiled again, precise and hollow. You have 72 hours. After that, daily penalties will accrue, and the association may proceed with removal actions for continued trespass. The breeze picked up, carrying the smell of wet cedar and lake water. Somewhere across the shoreline, a loon called, a lonely, echoing sound that made the moment feel even more surreal. Vivian snapped her tablet shut. We pride ourselves on maintaining community standards, Mr. Reeves. I trust you'll make the responsible choice. She returned to her cart, the electric motor humming quietly as she drove away, leaving a trail of dust that drifted upward like smoke. I looked down at the red notice still crumpled in my hand. My uncle's land. My family's lake. And some HOA president thought she could bill me for touching it. The anger rose slowly, not hot and wild, but cold, like deep water in winter. Behind me, the lodge windows reflected the sunlight, shimmering like eyes watching, waiting. My uncle must have known something. This land didn't fight back for decades unless someone had been pushing on it. I looked back toward the ridge where Vivian disappeared. Why, I muttered, would the HOA find the man who owns the entire lake? The lake offered no answer, just the steady rhythm of waves tapping against the boat posts, as if urging me to find out. By late afternoon, the light had shifted, turning Coldwater Lake into a sheet of burnished silver. I'd barely had time to unpack, let alone process the idea that an HOA could claim authority over a place my family had guarded for nearly a century. I walked the shoreline, boots brushing through tall grass that whispered in the wind. Somewhere overhead, a hawk circled, its shadow gliding over water that still held the day's warmth. The lodge creaked behind me, old beams settling, as if waking from a long sleep. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine smoke and aged wood. Dust floated through shafts of gold light. My uncle hadn't left much behind. A stack of tools, a rack of fishing rods, and a few notebooks filled with sketches of the lake's contours. Still, I felt something watching me from the walls, questions he hadn't lived long enough to ask aloud. A sharp crunch sounded up the trail. I turned. Vivian Markham's electric cart reappeared, tires rolling softly over gravel. She stepped out with the same mechanical grace as before, tablet under her arm, silver hair unmoving in the breeze. I thought it might be beneficial to show you the areas Silvercrest Shores maintains, she said, gesturing toward the northern bend of shoreline. Perhaps a visual tour will help you understand the boundaries. I didn't trust her, but refusing would only give her ammunition. I motioned for her to lead on. The cart hummed along a narrow path that cut through pines and low brush. The air grew cooler, shadows long and sharp. Vivian narrated as we went, pointing out docks funded by residents, a boat ramp reserved for association members, and walking trails she claimed were integral community assets. But as she talked, something wasn't right. The docks looked newer than anything in the HOA's budget would justify. The boat ramp's concrete was poured too thick, too professional. and the walking trails cut deeply into land that clearly wasn't part of any subdivision. Old growth pines, moss-laced rocks, and lichen-covering boulders that had stood there long before Silvercrest Shores ever existed. "This is all HOA managed?" I asked. "Yes," she replied without hesitation. "We've cultivated this lakeside region for decades." I studied the shoreline. My uncle's old map flashed in my mind, the one he'd drawn by hand, showing boundaries that didn't match anything she was describing. If her claims were true, half the lakefront had somehow slipped from Reeves' control without anyone in the family knowing. We stopped near a turnout overlooking the water. Sunlight caught the ripples, throwing scattered reflections across Vivian's blazer. "Fines are issued to preserve order," she continued, "and to prevent misuse of shared property." "Shared?" I said, letting the word hang. "You're aware this lake is on Reeves' land?" Vivian offered a tight smile. "You may find that land records have evolved since your family last participated in community affairs. Boundaries shift. Agreements lapse. Our maps are current. If you disagree, you may petition after settling your outstanding charges." She tapped her tablet and the cart door clicked open, signaling the tour had ended. I walked back toward the lodge on foot, needing air. The trail wound past a cluster of birch trees, their white trunks glowing in the dimming light. Halfway there, a voice drifted from behind me. "New owner, huh?" I turned to see a man leaning on a split-rail fence. Mid-30s, sun-weathered skin, baseball cap pulled low, jeans patched at the knees. He carried the look of someone who knew the land far better than the politics on it. "Name's Eli," he said, offering a hand. "Eli Mercer. I live just over that ridge." I shook his hand. "Colton Reeves." He nodded slowly. "Figured. Heard the rumors. Didn't think you'd actually come." "Rumors?" "That the old Reeves boy would inherit the lake but wouldn't dare show his face with the HOA running things." He glanced down the trail toward where Vivian had disappeared. "They don't take kindly to independence." "You've dealt with them?" Eli's jaw tightened. "Everyone around here has. They find folks for everything. Wrong mailbox color, shadow from a tree, even the sound of wind chimes if they say it violates noise standards. People pay because fighting costs more. But you," he paused, studying me carefully, "you might be the first person they can't scare." I breathed in the scent of pine drifting up from the lake. "They fined me $100,000 for stepping onto my own dock." He gave a humorless laugh. "Oh, they're testing you. Vivian's been itching to claim that shoreline. Says the lake makes the community valuable." He leaned closer, voice lowering. "Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything. And don't let them get inside your house." I frowned. "Why not?" But Eli only shook his head. "Because once they do, they'll say you've violated codes you didn't even know existed." He stepped back. "Just be careful. They've been bullying this place for years." He disappeared down a side path, boots crunching through fallen leaves. Inside the lodge, evening shadows stretched across the floorboards. Something about Eli's words clung to me, like a chill that wouldn't leave the skin. I walked into the main room and paused, noticing for the first time a faint seam in the floor near the stone hearth. Kneeling, I slid my fingers along it. Dust gave way to cold metal. A latch. I pried it open. The floorboard lifted with a groan, revealing a rusted safe hidden beneath the planks. Its iron edges were pitted, and the handle squealed in protest when I turned it. After several tugs, the door gave way. Inside lay a bundle of documents wrapped in waxed cloth. Carefully, I unrolled them. Old paper, yellowed at the edges, cracked under my touch. The first page was a deed, dated 1954, bearing my grandfather's name in bold script. But several pages were missing, cleanly torn from the binding. My pulse quickened. And there, beneath the deed, lay a note in my uncle's unmistakable hand. If you're reading this, you'll need what comes next. They've stolen more than anyone knows. The wind rattled the window panes. I stared at the torn deed. Something big was missing. Something the HOA didn't want found. And the question grew sharper, colder, more dangerous. Who exactly claimed the lake? And how had they gotten away with it? Morning came early on the ranch, the kind of early that seeped into your bones. A pale curtain of mist floated across Coldwater Lake, drifting like breath on glass. Birds called from the pines, and the old dock creaked as the lake shifted beneath it. It should have been peaceful, quiet enough to settle any man's mind, but mine hadn't stopped turning since the moment I found those missing deed pages. By the time I stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee, something bright slapped against the lodge door. Another notice. The red ink glared like an accusation. I peeled it free and felt my jaw tighten. Violation. Unauthorized structure on HOA-governed shoreline. Fine, $15,000. My boots hadn't even touched dirt yet for the day. I took a breath, steady and controlled, and walked around the lodge. 3 more orange papers fluttered in the wind. Visual obstruction, unsafe railing, improper refuse storage. One notice claimed the cabin itself was unregistered housing. The cabin my grandfather built with his own hands. Wind rattled the pines overhead, carrying the scent of damp earth and lake water. I could feel the pressure now, the HOA pushing, squeezing, seeing how fast they could force me off my own land. By the time I reached the clearing near the main gate, a white SUV with county markings rolled up. Sheriff Dana Holt stepped out, adjusting her hat against the morning sun. She looked too young to be carrying the weight behind her eyes. "Morning, Mr. Reeves," she said, voice steady but strained. "Sheriff?" I folded my arms. "Let me guess. More notices?" "Worse." She reached into her jacket and handed me a folded document. "The HOA filed a preliminary eviction claim. I'm required by county policy to inform you they're pursuing removal if the fines aren't paid." I stared at the paper. Eviction from land they don't own? Sheriff Holt's eyes softened. "Look, I know how this sounds. I know your family's history out here, but the HOA's been aggressive lately. They've pushed people off their properties before. Some folks can't afford to fight. That doesn't make it legal. Maybe not, but they act faster than the courts do." She tucked her hands into her belt. "Be careful, Colton. They'll try to use every inch you give them." Her voice carried an unspoken warning, one carved from experience, not duty. Before she left, she hesitated. "My brother lost his home last year. Fines piled up until he had no choice. Something isn't right here." Then she stepped into her SUV and drove off, dust rising behind her like smoke. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the rustling of leaves. I turned back toward the lake, and that's when I noticed movement on the far shore. Boats. Not one, but 3. HOA boats. Each carried groups of residents wearing matching windbreakers, pointing at the shoreline as if giving tours. Their laughter carried across the water, buoyed by the breeze. But what made my heart punch once, hard, was the lettering on the side of the lead boat. Reeves Lake Tours, my grandfather's brand. My uncle never ran tours. He never allowed commercial boats on the lake. So how did the HOA get the name? And worse, how long had they been profiting off my family's water? The sun climbed higher, spreading a wash of gold across the surface. I walked back into the lodge, determined to dig deeper. The interior was cool and shadowed, dust swirling through the light. The open safe still lay where I'd left it, deeds and handwritten notes inside. I pulled the rest of the papers out and laid them across the kitchen table, maps with faded ink, water flow diagrams, shoreline sketches from my uncle's hand. But nothing explained the missing deed pages. Frustration simmered beneath my skin. Then I spotted the old rotary phone mounted to the wall. The line might still work. I dialed the number on a card Sheriff Holt had given me, Ruth Vang, land use attorney, and left a message describing the violations, the fines, the foreclosure threat. As I hung up, a distant crunch of gravel pulled me back to the window. 2 men in gray uniforms were standing at the property line, rolling out a chain across the private ranch road. One held a clipboard. I stepped outside. "What do you think you're doing?" The clipboard holder didn't look up. "Silvercrest security perimeter check." "On my land?" He shrugged without apology. "Boundary lines fall under HOA jurisdiction. This is a restricted access zone." "No, it's not. Remove the chain." He scribbled something on his clipboard. "Refusal to comply will result in a fine." A cold wave of anger rippled through me. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that sharpens a man's focus. "You're trespassing," I said calmly. He finally looked up, smirking. "According to our maps, no. According to yours, well, good luck proving it." They walked off, leaving the chain glinting in the sun like a warning. Inside the lodge, I paced the worn wooden floorboards, hearing each creak, as if the land itself were restless. The lake's steady rhythm echoed through the windows. My uncle hadn't been paranoid. He had been preparing for a fight. Something big, bigger than fines and boats and fake tours. There was a storm underneath all this, and the HOA wasn't just pushing boundaries. They were rewriting them. My phone buzzed suddenly. A voicemail transcription from Ruth appeared. "Mr. Reeves, your situation is serious. The document you described shouldn't exist without federal filings. I need to see everything in person. Do not engage the HOA further until we talk." I lowered the phone, the lodge dimming around me as the sun shifted behind clouds. Pressure tightened from every direction, fines stacking, threats rising, boundaries closing. And underneath it all, a question pulsed like a heartbeat. What had my uncle been trying to stop? Outside, sunlight sparkled on the water's surface, cold and bright. But beneath that glittering calm, something dark moved, a history buried in missing pages and stolen access. I stepped onto the porch, the wind lifting the hair at my temples, carrying a faint metallic scent from the ridge. This wasn't just harassment. It was the start of a machine tightening its grip, and I intended to find every gear in it. The sky burned a pale orange the next morning, the kind of sunrise that felt more like a warning than a welcome. Coldwater Lake lay still as a sheet of glass, reflecting the ridgeline where pine silhouettes rose like dark sentries. The wind had that sharp, metallic edge of early Montana autumn, and every breath tasted like wood smoke and coming trouble. I spent the early hours sorting through the documents again. Old deeds, hand-drawn maps, water flow journals, all of it laid across the lodge's long kitchen table. But the missing pages from the 1954 deed gnawed at me like a loose board in a windstorm. Whatever had been torn from that document wasn't random. It was intentional, clean, precise, and devastating. At 9 a.m., a dusty Subaru rolled up the gravel drive. A woman stepped out, straight-backed and efficient, hair tied into a dark knot that didn't move even when the breeze caught her coat. She carried a leather briefcase and a thermos that steamed in the chilly air. "Mr. Reeves?" she asked. "I'm Ruth Vang." Her voice carried the calm confidence of someone who had spent too many years dealing with other people's disasters. I nodded. "Thanks for coming on such short notice." "I heard urgency in your message," she said simply. "Let's take a look." Inside the lodge, she studied the papers with the focus of a surgeon. She picked up the deed, turning it gently under the light, then laid it flat and traced the edges with her fingers. "These pages weren't torn out by accident," she said. "They were removed by someone who knew exactly what they were doing." I leaned on the table. What do you think was on them? Ruth reached into her briefcase and pulled out a weathered book of Montana land statutes. In the 1950s, particularly around lakes and rivers, land deeds often included appendices outlining water rights, surface access, subsurface aquifers, distribution rights. She paused. If those pages are missing, someone wanted to erase ownership clarity. I felt the weight settle in my chest. Erase how far those rights go? Exactly. She flipped to a section marked with a yellow tab. This language mentions water extending beyond the lake, possibly into aquifers beneath the ridge. My pulse quickened. Meaning this lake isn't just valuable for its shoreline. She tapped the map. If your family controlled an aquifer, they controlled every drop flowing beneath Silvercrest shores. The idea hit like a hammer. Water in this part of Montana wasn't just for recreation. It was power, control, money. Ruth continued, if the HOA expanded their boundaries illegally, they may have been accessing water they never had the right to touch. A gust of wind rattled the windows, scattering dust motes across the table like snow. Show me everything, Ruth said. We spent the next hour going through maps, my uncle's sketches, old county surveys, faded blueprints. The deeper we dug, the more inconsistencies appeared. Boundaries shifted. Shoreline moved. Trails that shouldn't exist connected places they had no legal right to touch. Wind whispered along the eaves as we stepped outside, boots sinking into soft earth as we crossed toward the northern edge of the property. Pines swayed overhead, their branches sighing under the weight of the breeze. Ruth studied the slope, the angle of the ground, the flow of old irrigation trenches. Then she froze. What's that? She asked. Half buried near a patch of alder trees was a metal hatch, barely visible under a blanket of fallen needles. I crouched, brushed the debris aside, and pulled. The hatch groaned open, revealing a concrete-lined shaft with rust-stained pipes snaking downward. Ruth's breath caught. This is a pump access point. I swung my flashlight in. The beam illuminated steel conduits running north, directly toward the HOA subdivision. She pulled out her phone and snapped photos. This looks new. 10, maybe 15 years old. This isn't on any map, I said. It wouldn't be. Her voice tightened. Not if they didn't want it found. The deeper we examined the site, the clearer it became. The HOA had been drawing water straight from the aquifer beneath Reeves Land, and they hadn't done it quietly. Fresh tire tracks led through the brush, forming a path used far more frequently than the wilderness here should allow. Ruth stepped back, her expression darkening. Colton, this isn't simple trespass. If they're diverting water unlawfully, it's theft, large-scale theft. We followed the path another 100 yards until it opened onto a clearing where a squat concrete structure stood, painted beige to blend into the landscape. A small sign bolted to the side caught the afternoon light. Markham & Sons Infrastructure Services, Vivian's family business. My hands curled into fists at my sides, not from rage but from the chilling confirmation of a truth forming piece by piece. Ruth exhaled slowly. They built this without permits, no environmental impact assessment, no access rights, no easements. She looked at me. This is the kind of thing that puts people in prison. Wind swept through the clearing, rustling dry grass and carrying the faint hum of machinery beneath the hatch. What do we do now? I asked. Ruth snapped another photo. Document everything. Take samples, get timestamps, and do not confront them yet. They don't know what we've found. As we made our way back to the lodge, the lake shimmered through the trees like a silent witness. My uncle must have known. He must have discovered something before the illness took him. The missing deed pages, the hidden safe, it all pointed to a truth he'd been trying to protect. Back inside, I placed the deed beside the photos of the pump station. The evidence pile was growing, and with each piece, the outline of a crime grew sharper. A knock echoed through the lodge. I opened the door to find a delivery envelope on the step. No return address, just my name written in block letters. Inside was a single paper. Cease and desist. Unauthorized disturbance of HOA infrastructure. Fine. $20,000. They knew I'd been near the pump. But how? Ruth stared at the notice. They're monitoring their illegal station more closely than legal ones. I looked out across the lake, shadows lengthening over the water, swallowing the reflection of the ridge. A new question rose, one colder and heavier than the rest. What else were they hiding beneath this lake? Evening settled over Coldwater Lake like a slow exhale. The wind drifted through the pines, brushing needles against one another, until they whispered like restless voices. Shadows stretched across the ranch as the sun dipped behind the ridge, staining the sky a bruised purple. I should have felt the peace of the place. My uncle always said dusk was when the lake truly breathed, but the view only sharpened the unease gripping my chest. Ruth stayed long enough to gather copies of every document before promising to file emergency record requests in the morning. When she left, the silence inside the lodge deepened, broken only by the creak of old beams and the faint tapping of lake water against the dock. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the growing pile of violations and evidence, knowing I was barely scratching the surface. When the knock came, it startled me. Not sharp or urgent, 3 light taps, hesitant. I opened the door to find Eli Mercer standing on the porch, jacket pulled tight against the cold. His face held the same weary caution I'd seen the first time we spoke. "Evening, Colton," he said. "Mind if I come in for a minute?" "Sure." I stepped aside. He looked around the lodge slowly, his gaze taking in the exposed beams, old fishing gear on the wall, and the open safe. When his eyes landed on the deed and photos spread across the table, his shoulders dropped. "So it's true," he murmured. "You're digging." "I have to. They pushed too far." Eli rubbed his palms together, as though trying to warm more than his hands. "Then maybe it's time you heard the rest." We sat at the table, a lantern casting soft light across the wood. Outside, the lake lapped steadily, like a pulse keeping time. Eli's voice dropped. "You're not the first one they've tried to break. Folks in this community have been scared for years. Some ran, some fought, most gave up." "What happened?" He exhaled slowly. 5 years ago, I planted a row of fir trees on my property line. Thought they'd give shade, maybe block the road noise. Vivian slapped me with a $40,000 fine, claimed the shadows from the trees encroached on community light rights. A month later, she filed a lien. I almost lost the house. That's insane. That's Silvercrest. He looked at the wall, jaw tightening. My wife left, said she couldn't live under their thumb anymore. Took our boy with her. I sat back, the weight of his words settling in like cold air. The HOA wasn't just mismanaging. They were ruining lives. Eli continued. "You want to know how many people got forced out of their homes? 12 in the last decade. Some bought out cheap, some shamed into selling. A few threatened. And every time Vivian's group expanded the community boundary. More land, more fees, more control." I shook my head. "They've been using this lake like a private resort." "That's just the top layer." Eli reached into his coat and pulled out a small USB drive, setting it on the table. Its silver casing glinted in the lantern light. "A neighbor gave me this a few years back. She moved after they fined her for repainting her deck the wrong shade of beige. She said it held financial reports, but I never had the nerve to open it. Figured it'd only make things worse." "Why bring it now?" He met my eyes, and for the first time I saw hope beneath the fatigue. Because you're different. They're scared of you. They think you'll fight, and I think you will too. Wind rattled the shutters as if the lodge itself agreed. Eli, I said quietly, why didn't anyone report them? He laughed, but it was hollow, like a man remembering a joke that had hurt. Some did. Sheriff Holt tried more than once, but the county backed the HOA every time. They've got ties, money, influence, favors traded behind closed doors. People around here learned that resistance only made the hammer drop harder. The lantern flickered, throwing shadows across the deed papers. The missing pages stared back at me like empty eyes. Eli rose to leave. At the door, he paused. If you decide to use that drive, be careful. There's things in this valley that run deeper than the lake. After he left, I plugged in the USB. A folder opened. Inside were spreadsheets, scanned receipts, HOA budgets, and payment transfers. 15 years' worth. With each file, a new thread of the truth began to unravel. Maintenance fees funneled into consultation firms, shoreline improvement funds wired to shell companies, water use charges increased yearly without explanation. One sheet froze me in place. Pump station maintenance schedule, Coldwater Ridge. It listed the same company stamped on the hidden pump, Markham & Sons Infrastructure. Vivian's husband wasn't just involved. He was running a network. My stomach tightened. This wasn't mismanagement. It wasn't incompetence. It was an empire built on theft, water theft, land theft, financial theft, and my family's lake was the centerpiece. A soft knock interrupted my spiraling thoughts. Sheriff Holt stood at the door, her expression grim. "Colton," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder before stepping inside. "I need to warn you. I just got word from dispatch." She nodded at the lodge windows. "Vivian's filing for expedited foreclosure. They want you out within 48 hours. My hands curled into fists. "She's moving fast." "Too fast," Holt said. "People who know they're right move slow. People who know they're wrong rush." Her voice softened. "Listen, residents are talking. They think you might be the one to stop this. People are scared, but they're watching." I nodded slowly. "What about you, Sheriff?" Her eyes hardened. "Me? I'm tired of watching this valley get carved apart by those who think they're untouchable." When she left, I stood alone in the silence, the lake's reflection shimmering through the windows. Outside, a faint breeze rolled across the basin, carrying the smell of wet pine and a promise of a coming storm. The evidence on the table looked different now, no longer pieces of a puzzle, but weapons. Truth, sharpened and waiting. Something inside me settled, cold and steady. If they wanted a fight, they picked the wrong Reeves. I gathered the deed, the photos, the USB, and the violation stack, arranging them in neat piles. And as the wind rattled the lodge once more, I whispered to myself, this wasn't just harassment anymore. This was a reckoning. By dawn, a thin mist hovered over Coldwater Lake, moving like slow breath across the water's glassy skin. The pines stood motionless on the ridge, their dark silhouettes cutting through the first hints of morning light. The lodge smelled faintly of wood and cold air as I packed the evidence into neat stacks. Maps, violation notices, deeds, pump station photos, and the USB containing a decade and a half of financial secrets. I didn't sleep. Not really. My mind kept circling around everything I'd learned. My family's stolen water rights, the hidden pump station, the forged boundary maps, the HOA's pattern of crushing anyone who dared resist. By sunrise, one thing had become painfully clear. Vivian's empire wasn't built on community rules. It was built on the quiet theft of an entire valley. At 7 a.m., Ruth returned, stepping into the lodge with her coat dusted by morning frost. I stayed up most of the night, she said, placing her briefcase on the table. I've been combing through county archives and the state database, and I found something you need to see. She slid a folder toward me. Inside were documents stamped with county seals, property line descriptions, and surveyor signatures. The most important one, a map dated 22 years ago, showed the Silvercrest Shores boundary stopping more than 100 yards away from the lake. But the current map, the one the HOA plastered everywhere, showed the boundary pressed tightly against the lake's edge. They redrew it, I said. They didn't just redraw it, Ruth replied. They filed it as an amended record, without the required notices, and the signature verifying it belonged to a surveyor who retired before this was even submitted. I stared at the old map, tracing the rightful boundary with my finger. My chest tightened. So everyone who bought lakeside property was given a fraudulent impression of shoreline rights, she finished. The land they think belongs to them actually belongs to you. And worse, she pulled out another sheet. Silvercrest Shores has been paying your lake's pump system maintenance fees to Markham & Sons Infrastructure. Vivian's husband, I muttered. Ruth nodded. $3 million in payments over 15 years for a pump station built illegally on your land. Before I could respond, headlights cut across the pine trunks outside. A black SUV pulled up the driveway. Ruth tensed. Expecting someone? No, I said quietly. The door opened and Sheriff Holt stepped out, her expression tight with urgency. She jogged up the porch and knocked once before pushing in. Colton, you need to hear this, she said, closing the door behind her. Vivian's called an emergency HOA meeting this evening. Claims there's been hostile interference with community operations, and she's naming you directly in the agenda. Ruth's jaw tightened. She's trying to frame him before the truth comes out. It gets worse, Holt added. She's gathered deputies she knows are friendly to her. Word is she's planning to serve immediate foreclosure papers during that meeting. They're hoping you'll refuse or react badly so they can push you out. A cold, controlled anger settled over me like a sheet of ice. Ruth's voice sharpened. Colton, you can't let them get ahead of this. You need to go public first. The residents need to see the truth before she poisons them with lies. I nodded. A community meeting. Your own, Holt added. Not theirs. I walked to the window, looking out at the lake's quiet expanse. The surface rippled faintly with the morning breeze, sunlight glinting off the water like scattered diamonds. Beneath that calm shimmered the aquifer, the true prize Vivian had been stealing from ever since she took control. My uncle must have discovered their scheme. The missing deed pages were likely proof. The lodge door creaked. Eli Mercer stepped in, hat in hand. Sorry to show up unannounced, he said quietly. But folks started talking. They saw sheriff cars near your ridge last night. People think something big is brewing. It is, I said, and they deserve to know. Eli swallowed hard. If you hold a meeting, people will come. They're scared, but they're angry too. Ruth crossed her arms. Then let's prepare. For the next 3 hours, we turned the lodge into a war room, an organized, methodical one. Ruth arranged documents into sequences: boundary fraud, water theft, unauthorized construction, financial mismanagement. Sheriff Holt documented every illegal move she'd seen the HOA make in the past 6 years. Eli helped set up a projector and screen against the lodge's log wall. The wind pushed cold air in through the cracks, carrying the scent of lake water and pine sap. Papers fluttered on the table like restless birds. Every new document added weight to the growing truth. Vivian's empire wasn't accidental corruption. It was intentional, systemic, and profitable. Just before noon, Ruth plugged in the USB. The screen lit up. A spreadsheet appeared, columns of payments, dates, and routing numbers. One line repeated every month. Silvercrest Shores, HOA, Markham & Sons Infrastructure, $72,000. That's pump maintenance, I said. Ruth shook her head. Pump maintenance shouldn't cost nearly $1 million a year. This is a laundering scheme. A folder labeled Land Reassignment caught my eye. I opened it. Blueprints, maps, notes about extending HOA boundaries, estimates of increased property values once the lake became fully absorbed into community amenities. Eli swore under his breath. They planned this from the start. Ruth looked at me. You can end it from the start, too. By late afternoon, our evidence filled 3 binders and a digital presentation. The wind outside had picked up, carrying dust along the ranch road like a warning. The lodge hummed with a quiet, steady determination. Then, at 6:14 p.m., while we were preparing the meeting notice, 3 sharp knocks rattled the door. Sheriff Holt reached it first, hand resting near her radio. A deputy stood outside, one who rarely made eye contact with her. He looked uncomfortable, sweat beading on his brow despite the crisp air. He handed her a sealed envelope. "This is from the HOA legal team," he muttered before walking away quickly. Holt tore it open and read aloud. "Notice of foreclosure initiation. Reeves property. Effective in 48 hours. Ruth exhaled sharply. They're terrified. They're escalating. Eli looked at me, fear mixing with belief. What are we going to do, Colton? The wind howled briefly through the chimney, and the shadows on the walls shifted like moving water. I picked up the deed, the pump photos, the forged map, the USB. We're going to show them the truth, I said. Tomorrow night. Holt nodded, Ruth nodded, Eli nodded. The lake outside the window seemed to still, listening. But deep beneath the surface, I knew the real battle was only beginning. A brittle quiet settled over the ranch that night, the kind that presses against the skin and makes every small sound feel louder than it should. Coldwater Lake rippled only in thin silver lines, reflecting a low-hanging moon that looked bruised around the edges. The pines swayed in slow arcs, branches brushing one another like whispered warnings. Inside the lodge, however, the air felt heavier, charged with purpose. Ruth remained at the table, reviewing chain of custody steps for every piece of evidence. Sheriff Holt typed reports with mechanical precision, framed by lamplight. Eli paced near the stone hearth, hat twisting in his hands, the fire casting warm flickers across the stacked binders. Yet despite the bustling movement, a pocket of silence sat at the center of the room, a stillness that grew thicker with every minute. I stepped out onto the porch, letting the cold air slap against my face. The world outside was darker than usual, as if the ridge itself were holding its breath. I stared toward the north trail, where the illegal pump station lay hidden. Somewhere beneath that slope, machinery hummed softly, stealing water in the shadows. Ruth joined me after a moment, arms wrapped around her coat. "You're awfully quiet," she said, voice gentler than usual. "Just thinking," I murmured. "About tomorrow? About 20 years' worth of theft being confronted in a single night." She sighed. "It's a lot." I nodded, but my eyes remained fixed on the lake. Vivian won't take this lightly. She'll have a plan. Ruth's gaze hardened. And so do we. Inside, Sheriff Holt closed her laptop and approached us. "We need to discuss something," she said. "Something bigger than the fines, the pump, the forged maps." I turned toward her. "What is it?" "There are deputies on the county force who answer to Vivian before they answer to the law," Holt said quietly. 3 of them were reassigned last week, without explanation. They've been patrolling the properties of outspoken residents, and one of them was making rounds near your ridge last night. My stomach tightened. "To intimidate? To send a message," she said. Eli joined us at the doorway, rubbing the back of his neck. "Whatever you're planning tomorrow, you're poking a very big sleeping bear." "We're not poking it," I said. We're dragging it into the sunlight. Holt cracked a thin smile. Just be ready. The wind picked up, carrying the metallic scent of the lake. The temperature dropped sharply, giving the evening a brittle edge. I returned inside and shut the door behind us. We worked until nearly midnight, sorting documents, backing up digital files, rehearsing the sequence of evidence we'd present. Every piece mattered. Every detail would be tomorrow's truth. Then, just as Ruth finished printing the last comparison map, there was a soft knock at the door. 3 taps, slow, shaking. I opened the door to find an elderly man hunched against the wind, gray beard tangled, coat soaked from lake mist. His shoulders sagged under the weight of something heavy, guilt, fear, or both. "Leon," Ruth whispered. The man's eyes lifted, watery and exhausted. "Ruth, I heard from some folks you were involved in this." Ruth's voice softened. "Come inside." He stepped into the warmth, trembling hands clutching the strap of a canvas bag. Sheriff Holt helped him sit by the fire. Eli poured him hot coffee. Leon Huxley, retired county surveyor, living ghost of the land office, had once been the authority on boundaries around Coldwater Lake, but he'd disappeared from public life a decade ago after a scandal wiped out his reputation. Now he looked like a man who'd carried a burden too long. "I shouldn't be here," he rasped, "but I can't stay silent anymore." Ruth knelt beside him. "We're listening." Leon's fingers shook as he unlatched the canvas bag. From it, he pulled a stack of rolled parchment, sealed tubes, and 2 leather-bound ledgers. "When Vivian's husband filed the amended boundary expansion back then," he said, voice cracking, "I was ordered to approve it. Ordered, not asked." He stared into the fire. "I refused, told them it didn't match the original lake survey." "What happened?" I asked. Leon swallowed hard. "The next week, I was accused of falsifying county records. My license was stripped, my reputation destroyed. Everything I said was labeled a lie." He unrolled one of the parchments and laid it flat across the table. The ink was faded but unmistakable. It was the original Coldwater boundary map. The map that proved the lake, and everything around it, belonged to the Reeves family. My breath caught. Ruth's eyes widened. Holt leaned closer. Leon tapped a trembling finger against a bold line. "This is the true boundary, the survey your grandfather authorized, the one filed with the Bureau of Land Administration. I made copies, before they took my office. Couldn't let the truth disappear." Emotion tightened his voice. "I've been waiting for someone, anyone, who could actually use this." I exhaled slowly. "Leon, this is what we've needed. This is everything." He shook his head. "Colton, it's more than that." He pulled a second map from the bag. "This is the forged one. The one they forced me to replace. See the shift? 200 yards south. That gave them shoreline. That gave them access. That gave them everything they stole." The room held its breath. For the first time, the entire puzzle lay on the table, and every piece fit. Outside, the wind howled across the lake, rattling branches like bones. A storm was rolling in, clouds gathering above the ridge, dimming the moonlight. Leon looked at me with haunted eyes. "You need to expose them, son, loudly, before they bury all of us." I rested a hand on his shoulder. "We will. Tomorrow night." He nodded weakly, sagging deeper into the chair. "Then I can finally sleep." As the fire crackled and rain began tapping softly against the windows, a strange calm washed over the lodge. Not the fragile calm of peace, but the steady, poised calm of a bowstring pulled tight. Tomorrow would be the reckoning. And we finally had the truth sharp enough to cut through anything the HOA threw our way. But the night had plans of its own. A storm rolled in before sunset, low clouds sweeping over the ridge like an advancing wall of smoke. Wind rattled the windows of the lodge, slipping through the cedar cracks with a cold whistle that made the lantern flames flicker. The air tasted metallic, charged, like the valley itself knew a battle was coming. Ruth, Sheriff Holt, Eli, and Leon helped secure the evidence for the next day's presentation. 3 binders, 2 original maps, digital backups, affidavits from Leon, and breakdowns of 15 years of siphoned water fees sat stacked on the long wooden table. Every page felt like a weapon, every document, ammunition. By the time evening settled, tension pressed into the cabin's walls like an approaching landslide. "I'll head back to town," Holt said, strapping her duty belt tighter. "Talk to a few deputies I trust. Make sure you're not ambushed before you even get to the meeting." "Thank you, Sheriff," I said. She gave a short nod and stepped out into the wind, pulling her coat close. For a moment, her truck's headlights illuminated the dirt drive, but the light disappeared quickly as the storm swallowed her. Inside, the others packed up. Leon carefully returned his old surveyor maps to the waterproof tube, his hands steadier than they had been earlier. "You're doing a brave thing tomorrow," he muttered. "All of you." Eli clapped him gently on the back. "No turning back now." But even as we tried to focus on the meeting ahead, the storm outside grew heavier, rain smacking the roof in a wild drumbeat. Thunder rumbled, deep and slow, rolling across Coldwater Lake like a warning. Then the lights went out. Pitch darkness swallowed the lodge. I stood still for a moment, listening. The storm roared outside, but inside there was nothing but a soft clicking, the sound of the refrigerator dying, and then silence. "Power's out," Ruth said, though we all knew it. Eli grabbed a lantern. "Storm must have knocked something out." But Leon shook his head. "I've lived on this lake a long time. Weather like this knocks out lines near the old mill, not on this side." He lowered his voice. "This feels deliberate." The lantern's glow flickered across our faces. I walked to the window and pushed the curtain aside. On the far shoreline, 3 boats moved in slow circles. Their floodlights swept across the water like search beams. The rain didn't seem to deter them. Their engines hummed steadily, too steadily for a volunteer patrol. HOA patrol boats. "They're watching us," Eli whispered. A sharp crack echoed from the ridge. Not lightning, metal. I grabbed my flashlight and threw on a jacket. "Stay inside. I need to see something." Ruth stepped forward. "You shouldn't go alone." "I won't," Eli said, planting himself beside me. The wind ripped across the porch as we stepped outside, lantern light streaming onto the rain-soaked ground. We moved toward the slope overlooking the northern trail, boots sliding in mud, the storm hitting harder by the minute. The smell of wet pine and cold stone filled the air. Halfway up the ridge, we saw it. The power pole feeding this side of the lake had been cut, clean, straight through, its severed wires sparking quietly against the wet earth. Not storm damage. Sabotage. Eli exhaled slowly. "They're scared, Colton. Scared enough to do something stupid." A second sound drifted up from the slope below, a low rumble followed by the crunch of tires on gravel. We crouched behind a boulder, rain dripping down our collars. 2 black SUVs rolled onto my property, headlights off. Men in gray raincoats stepped out, flashlights scanning the ground. "Who are they?" Eli whispered. I watched one of the men kneel and examine the severed power line. Another pointed toward the lodge. "HOA private security," I said. "Vivian's hired muscle." And they weren't here for a friendly visit. We stayed hidden until the SUVs turned around and drove off toward the subdivision, mud spraying behind their tires. The rain eased slightly, but the cold had sunk deep into my bones. Back inside the lodge, Ruth was pacing while Leon clutched his map tube like a lifeline. "False alarm," Eli said, shaking off water. "We're not under attack, but they cut the power deliberately. Ruth's jaw set. Because they think you'll break if they apply enough pressure, or because they don't want you printing or backing up anything else. They won't stop us, I said, lighting another lantern. Leon cleared his throat. There's more. We turned to him. I found something in my old notes, he said. A clause from your grandfather's deed. It wasn't in the missing pages, it was in a separate survey folder. He reached into his tube and pulled out a folded document. He handed it to me. My eyes scanned the faded type. All structures built along the northern shoreline beyond the reef's boundary shall be considered unlawful encroachments. I read faster. And no easement, implied or stated, may be granted without the consent of the Reeves family. Violations shall constitute illegal occupation. My breath caught. Leon, this says the HOA itself. Its walking paths, docks, even their lakeside properties, are built on Reeves land. He nodded solemnly. Every inch. The room fell silent. The storm outside eased to a steady drizzle, but inside tension snapped tight as wire. Ruth slowly lowered herself into a chair. Colton, this clause alone could dismantle their entire community. Eli let out a low whistle. No wonder they've been trying to bury your family's history. I stared at the document, feeling the weight of my grandfather's words. He had known. He had tried to protect this land even in his final years. And now, decades later, his voice reached forward through time, giving us the key we'd been searching for. A sharp knock jolted us. We all tensed. Then Sheriff Holt stepped inside, soaked to the bone, chest heaving. I just got word, she said. Vivian's preparing to move up her foreclosure. She's holding a closed-door session with county officials tonight. Ruth shot to her feet. We don't have much time. No, I said quietly. The lantern flames steadied. We have exactly enough. I lifted my grandfather's document, the ink glistening beneath the warm light. Tomorrow, we end this. Everyone nodded. Eli with quiet conviction, Ruth with calculated resolve, Holt with a sigh of relief she hadn't been able to feel in years, and Leon with a trembling hope. Outside, Coldwater Lake lay dark and motionless, as if bracing for the truth that would finally break the silence. Tomorrow, the valley would hear it. Every last word. By sunrise, the storm had passed, leaving a brittle stillness in its wake. A thin veil of fog drifted over Coldwater Lake, silver and ghost-like, as if the water were trying to hide what was coming. The pines stood washed clean, their dark branches dripping onto the forest floor. It was the quiet before a controlled burn, the kind that clears out rot so new things can grow. Ruth, Sheriff Holt, Eli, and Leon gathered in the lodge, each with a different kind of resolve in their eyes. The binders sat stacked neatly, the original maps rolled in protective tubes, and Leon's affidavit had been notarized at dawn. We had everything we needed. Ready? Ruth asked. I looked out at the lake one last time. More than ready. We drove separately to the county courthouse, Ruth in her Subaru, Holt in her patrol SUV, Eli and Leon with me in the Ford. The road cut through a corridor of towering pines, their tops catching the early sun. Every mile tightened something inside my chest. But not fear. Purpose. When the courthouse came into view, cars were already spilling out of the parking lot. Silvercrest residents, HOA board members, and half the town lined the steps. Whispers flickered through the crowd like sparks in dry grass. Vivian had summoned everyone early, hoping to frame the narrative before we arrived. Not today. Deputy Garrison, one of the sheriff's trusted men, opened the doors for us. They're already inside, he murmured. Vivian's been speaking for 15 minutes. We stepped into the courtroom, the air thick with murmurs and shifting tension. Nearly every bench was filled. Residents sat shoulder to shoulder, some clutching HOA notices, others clasping hands for comfort. Vivian Markham stood at the front, face composed, suit immaculate, pearls gleaming beneath the fluorescent lights. Her husband sat stiffly beside her, jaw locked. Their lawyer, a tall man with a slicked-back haircut and a smile too rehearsed to be honest, flipped through a stack of papers. Vivian paused when she noticed us, her gaze tightening like a vice. "Mr. Reeves," she said to the judge, "is here to obstruct and deflect from egregious violations of community ordinances, including trespassing, property damage, and interference with HOA." Judge Harriet Colburn rapped her gavel once. "Mrs. Markham, you will cease your statements until the court hears both sides." Vivian's smile faltered. Judge Colburn, a woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for zero tolerance of theatrics, nodded for us to approach. "Ms. Vang," she said, "you requested an emergency hearing. Present your evidence." Ruth stepped forward, calm as a surgeon. "Your Honor, what we have today is not a dispute about HOA rules, but a pattern of deception, forgery, land theft, and unauthorized use of private water infrastructure." A ripple of gasps swept the courtroom. Vivian rose sharply. "This is outrageous." "Sit down, Mrs. Markham," the judge said without raising her voice. Ruth opened the first binder. Exhibit 1. The original Coldwater Lake boundary map drawn in 1954 by the Reeves family and approved by the Bureau of Land Administration. She unfurled Leon's map on the projector. A hush fell. "This," Ruth continued, tapping the bold ink lines, "is the only legally recognized shoreline boundary for Coldwater Lake and the surrounding property. Note the distance between Silvercrest's plotted lines and the lake." The judge leaned in. Ruth switched to the forged map. Exhibit 2, a fraudulent expansion map filed 20 years ago under Markham & Sons Infrastructure, approved by a surveyor who had already retired. Leon pushed himself up, voice trembling but loud. "That signature is not mine. I testified against it then, and I testify against it now." The courtroom buzzed, louder this time. Ruth flipped to the next page. Exhibit 3. Photographs of an unauthorized pump station siphoning water directly from Reeves aquifers into Silvercrest shores for over 15 years. Gasps erupted. Even the bailiff's eyebrows shot up. Vivian's lawyer sprang to his feet. "This is fabricated." Ruth held up a receipt. Exhibit 4. Maintenance payments from Silvercrest Shores to Markham & Sons totaling over $3 million. All routed through shell companies created to obscure the source. Whispers surged like rising water. Sheriff Holt stepped forward. "Your Honor, I have witnessed multiple instances where HOA security trespassed onto Reeves land, and where complaints filed by residents mysteriously disappeared." Judge Colburn's gaze sharpened. "Is that your sworn testimony, Sheriff Holt?" "Yes, ma'am." Vivian's husband's face went pale. Ruth wasn't finished. She clicked to the USB contents, the spreadsheets showing 15 years of siphoned funds, falsified records, illegal property reassignment, and shell company transactions. Finally, she held up the deed clause Leon discovered, the one that would change everything. Exhibit 5. A provision from the Reeves family deed stating that any structure built on the northern shoreline without Reeves' consent constitutes illegal encroachment. She let the words sink in. "This means," she said quietly, "that the HOA subdivision itself was built on stolen land." The room exploded. Shock, murmurs, disbelief. Residents turned toward Vivian, faces twisted in fury, realization, betrayal. Some stood, some cried, some stared blankly at the floor as if the ground had shifted beneath them. Judge Colburn slammed the gavel 3 times. "Order!" Silence eventually clawed its way back into the room. Vivian rose, shaking with rage. "You cannot believe this. He's nothing but a trespasser who inherited a decaying lodge." "Enough," the judge said. The evidence is compelling, well documented, and frankly, damning. Vivian's lawyer tried to interject, but the judge cut him off. I am prepared to issue a preliminary ruling. The entire room held its breath. The judge lifted the forged map. Given the overwhelming evidence of fraud, unauthorized boundary manipulation, financial misconduct, and illegal use of private water resources, this court hereby nullifies all expansion deeds filed by Silvercrest Shores. A wave of stunned silence swept the room before gasps burst forth. Vivian staggered, gripping the table. Judge Colborne continued, voice unwavering. Additionally, all fines levied against Mr. Reeves are vacated. The foreclosure order is invalid. A federal inquiry into Markham & Sons infrastructure will begin immediately. The gavel slammed down. Vivian's world crumbled in the echo. But the judge wasn't done. The final determination of land ownership, she said, will be issued after review of all maps and testimony. Until then, all HOA operations are suspended. Shouts rose, anger, relief, shock, while Vivian's lawyer pulled her toward her seat as she tried to protest. I stood still, letting the weight of the moment settle. Everything we'd endured, every threat, every violation, every night of fear, had led to this single turning point. But the reckoning wasn't over. Judge Colborne adjusted her glasses. Court adjourned until tomorrow morning, where I will rule on the fate of the Silvercrest Shores subdivision. The air seemed to stop. Tomorrow, the HOA's future would be decided. And by the way Vivian collapsed into her chair, pale and trembling, she already knew the truth. Her empire had finally begun to fall. But the next morning, as sunlight broke through the thinning clouds, the courthouse steps were filled with a different kind of energy. Residents gathered in clusters, some whispering, some angry, some hopeful. Coldwater Lake glistened beyond the ridge, calm as polished stone, as if waiting for the final verdict, just like the rest of us. Ruth walked beside me up the courthouse steps, her briefcase held tight against her side. "You ready?" she asked. "Yes," I said, because it was true, and because it had to be. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with nervous anticipation. The wooden benches creaked under the shifting weight of 100 people. Leon sat in the front row, hands folded over his cane. Eli stood near the aisle, giving me a small nod. Sheriff Holt leaned against the wall, uniform crisp, eyes alert. Vivian and her husband were already seated at the defendant's table. She wore a new suit, pale blue, pressed to perfection, but her shoulders sagged and her hands trembled. Her lawyer whispered urgently, but she stared past him, hollow-eyed, as if the room itself had turned hostile. Judge Harriet Colborne entered, her presence slicing through the noise. When she raised her gavel, the room fell silent. "This court has reviewed all submitted evidence, maps, testimonies, and financial records," she began. "Today, we render final judgment on the land rights surrounding Coldwater Lake and the operations of Silvercrest Shores Homeowners Association." I exhaled, slow and steady. Judge Colborne turned first to the binder containing Leon's maps. "The evidence shows incontrovertible proof that original boundary lines were unlawfully altered." A murmur swept the room. "Furthermore," she continued, "the use of Reeves aquifer systems without consent constitutes theft under Montana state law." Vivian's lawyer rose. "Your Honor, I must protest." "You may sit down," the judge said without looking at him. The lawyer sat. Judge Colborne picked up the deed clause Leon had uncovered. "This provision makes clear that the Reeves family never relinquished shoreline control nor granted easements to the subdivision. Therefore, all structures, docks, trails, utilities, built upon Reeves' land were done so illegally." A stunned silence hung like fog. Vivian's lips pressed together until they whitened. The judge turned her gaze toward me. "In recognition of these findings, this court hereby rules: Coldwater Lake, its shoreline, the northern ridge, and all connected aquifers belong solely to the Reeves estate. Gasps, whispers, a stunned cry from somewhere in the back. My hands curled around the bench until the wood bit into my palms. Judge Colborne continued, voice steady. All fines, liens, and claims against Mr. Reeves are void. The attempted foreclosure is vacated with prejudice. Relief rippled through the room, more palpable than any breeze. But then her tone shifted, firm, final, unmovable. As for Silvercrest Shores Homeowners Association, given the proven fraud, boundary manipulation, water theft, and misuse of resident fees, this court orders the immediate dissolution of the HOA. Chaos erupted. Shouts, gasps, arguments breaking loose like a dam giving way. The judge let it swell for only a moment before slamming the gavel until silence returned. She lifted her chin. Furthermore, all residents of Silvercrest Shores will transition to corrected lease agreements under the Reeves Family Trust. Rent will be set at fair market value, substantially lower than previous HOA dues. Dozens of residents began crying. Relief, shock, gratitude. Vivian rose to her feet, shaking. You can't do this. I built that community. I protected it. You can't. Her lawyer tugged her sleeve, whispering frantically, but she jerked away, pointing at me with trembling hands. This is your doing. You think you can just stroll back into this valley and take over everything we... Her voice broke. She turned toward the crowd. I did this for you, for all of you. But the faces staring back were no longer loyal subjects. They were victims waking from a long sleep. Judge Colborne's voice cut through the tension. Mrs. Markham, please remain silent. The court has one final announcement. 2 federal agents entered the courtroom, badges glinting under the fluorescent lights. Based on the evidence reviewed, the judge said, as well as findings from federal investigations initiated yesterday afternoon, the court authorizes the immediate arrest of Vivian Markham and Thomas Markham for wire fraud, water theft, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. Gasps surged again. Vivian's face drained of color. No, she whispered. Not like this. The agents approached quietly. Her husband stood, resigned, as cuffs clicked around his wrists. Vivian fought her own breath, shoulders shaking, but she didn't resist as the agents guided her forward. She looked at me once, eyes rimmed red, fury mixed with something else, something like disbelief that this day had ever come. You destroyed us, she said. I met her gaze steadily. No, you destroyed yourself. I just brought the truth to light. The agents led the Markhams out. The heavy courtroom doors closed behind them with a sound like final judgment. Silence lingered. Then applause rose, slow at first, then swelling, wave after wave of gratitude, relief, and release. Sheriff Holt bowed her head. Ruth let out a breath that trembled at the edges. Leon wiped tears from his beard. Eli clapped until his palms reddened. When the noise finally softened, Judge Colborne addressed the room one last time. Coldwater Lake will now be restored to lawful stewardship. Let this be a lesson to every governing body. Authority is not ownership, and power without integrity is nothing at all. The gavel struck. Court adjourned. Outside, sunlight spilled across the courthouse steps, warm and golden. The air smelled like wet earth and pine. Residents approached me, not with fear, but with hope. Some thanked me. Some apologized for not speaking sooner. Some simply cried into my shoulder. Ruth joined me at the bottom of the steps. I hope you're ready, she said with a small smile. Your life just changed forever. Good, I said. It needed to. We drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon. The lake shimmered like a newly polished jewel. The storm had cleared, leaving nothing but reflection and quiet. Standing on my grandfather's dock, I felt the weight of the past lift. Not gone, but finally acknowledged. Finally honored. Ruth stepped beside me, handing me a sealed envelope. This came from the State Water Board while we were in court. I tore it open. Inside was a notice about 2 counties west, an HOA claiming new pipe rights on land that didn't belong to them. The board wanted expert review. Ruth's eyes held a spark. Round 2? I looked across the lake, breeze tugging at my jacket, the smell of pine and deep water filling my lungs. Yeah, I said softly. Round 2. The sun sank behind the ridge, turning the water gold. Coldwater Lake, my lake, rested in quiet victory. And for the first time since returning to this land, I felt something settle deep inside me. Not anger, not fear. Purpose. If you've ever stood your ground against an HOA or anybody who tried to take what's yours, drop a simple justice in the comments. And if stories about courage, land, and doing what's right speak to you, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next fight on the horizon.